The signal came in at 3:17 in the morning, and I almost missed it because I was asleep on my couch with a half-eaten bowl of instant noodles on my chest and the television still running. My name is Mara Voss. I am 34 years old. I have a doctorate in xenolinguistics from the University of Chicago, and I had not left my apartment in 4 months. The coffee maker woke me. Not an alarm, not a phone. The coffee maker. It started clicking in a pattern that had nothing to do with brewing anything. A dry, rhythmic tapping that cut through the television noise and the fog in my head and sat me straight up with the bowl of noodles sliding sideways onto the cushion. I stared at it from the couch for 10 seconds. Then I got up. The clicking was coming through the Wi-Fi chip. The coffee maker was smart. Everything was smart. And something had found its way through the building's open network and latched onto the nearest device with a speaker. I know this sounds unimpressive. I know a galactic distress call arriving through a coffee maker sounds like the setup to a bad joke. But that is what happened, and I stood in my kitchen in an oversized university sweatshirt and socks with a hole in the left heel and listened to something that had traveled further than I can honestly make my brain comprehend, arriving through a coffee maker, clicking at me in the dark. I grabbed my recorder. I grabbed my laptop. I made actual coffee, which felt absurd and also deeply necessary, and I sat down at my kitchen table at 3:22 in the morning and started working. It took 6 hours. Xenolinguistics is not a glamorous field. People imagine it as the stuff of dramatic movie scenes, a genius cracking an alien code in real time while everyone watches and holds their breath. The reality is closer to sitting with a headache and a spreadsheet, running pattern frequency analysis, and pulling at structural threads until something gives. It is tedious. It is also, if you are wired a particular way, completely absorbing in a manner that crowds out every other thought, every anxiety, every reason to look up from the screen. I had not been absorbed in anything for 4 months. By 6 in the morning I had the broad structure. By 8 I had the core vocabulary. By 9 I understood that what I was reading was not a greeting. It was a plea. 17 species, organized under something they called the Galactic Conclave, were being systematically destroyed by an empire called the Vreth. The Vreth did not negotiate. They did not offer terms in any real sense. They arrived at a civilization's home system, demonstrated their capability to end it, and gave one choice: complete submission or complete erasure. The Conclave had been watching its member species disappear one by one, and so they had done the only thing left to them. They sent distress calls into the void. 43 civilizations received the signal. 42 declined. I found their responses in the metadata, filed neatly in a subdirectory I almost missed. Each one was formal, articulate, and final. Resource limitations, political neutrality, calculated survival. The language was different in each case, but the meaning was identical. Not our problem. I sat with that for a moment. Then I found Earth's file. It was empty. Not a refusal, not a response of any kind. Earth's file was completely blank, because the signal had come in at 3 in the morning and landed in a coffee maker in a studio apartment in Chicago, and nobody with any official authority had seen it yet. I looked at the empty file for a long time. Then I went back to the main transmission and kept translating. Buried near the end, in a section I initially flagged as metadata and almost skipped, was something that stopped me cold. It was an audio file, 14,000 hours long, attached to the distress call like a weight around its neck, and when I opened the first few seconds I understood immediately what it was. Names. The Conclave's culture held that unnamed dead ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. A person unmemorialized was a person unmade. So they had recorded every name of every individual killed by the Vreth across every conquered civilization, spoken aloud in the original language, one after another, without pause. 14,000 hours of names. I listened to 4 minutes of it. I am not going to describe what 4 minutes of listening to that does to a person. I will say that when I finally stopped the playback, my coffee was cold, and my hands were not entirely steady, and the apartment felt different than it had before. In a way I do not know how to articulate except to say that the silence had a new quality, heavier and more specific. I picked up my phone. It was 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. I called the United Nations Bureau of Extraterrestrial Affairs, which is a real government department that shares an office building with a branch of the Motor Vehicle Authority on the 4th floor in New York, and which has a staff of 11 people, 4 of whom are interns. The phone rang 7 times. Someone picked up. I told them what I had. I told them about the conclave, about the Vreth, about the 42 refusals and the empty file. I told them about the names. There was a pause on the other end. "Can you come in?" the person said. I looked around my apartment. 4 months of dishes done, but nothing else. Curtains that had been closed since February. A stack of unopened mail on the counter that I had been treating as furniture. "Yes," I said. I had not said yes to anything in 4 months. I hung up. I found my coat. I opened the door of my apartment, and the hallway light was very bright, and the air smelled like the building's old carpet and someone's breakfast, and I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the frame. The coffee maker was still clicking behind me. I let go of the frame. I stepped out. I pulled the door shut. I called the Department of Defense from the subway. They transferred me 3 times. The 3rd time, someone actually picked up, and I could tell from the quality of the silence on their end, after I explained what I had, that whatever was about to happen next was going to be large and loud and probably irreversible. I was not going to stop it. I was not entirely sure I wanted to. 42 civilizations had done the math and walked away. I understood the math. The math made complete sense. The Vreth were powerful, the conclave was losing, and getting between them was the kind of decision that ends civilizations rather than saving them. But I had listened to 4 minutes of names, and Earth's file was still empty. And I am from South Chicago, where we have a particular cultural relationship with the concept of walking away from a problem, which is to say we tend not to, even when every sensible instinct is telling us to do exactly that, even when the math is clear, even when every other reasonable actor in the situation has already cut their losses and gone home. The train lurched into the station. I got off. I had a translated distress signal in my bag, a government appointment in 40 minutes, and the sound of 14,000 hours of names sitting somewhere behind my eyes where I could not stop hearing it. That was how it started. Not with a dramatic speech, not with a war council, or a moment of inspiration, or any of the things that get written about later when people try to make a story out of events that were mostly chaos and poor sleep and cold coffee. It started with a coffee maker at 3 in the morning and a file that was empty when it should have had a response in it. It started because nobody official had been awake to say no. I have thought about that a great deal in the months since. The precise, specific accident of it. The 42 civilizations that looked at the data and made the rational choice. The one planet where the signal landed in a kitchen appliance and woke up a xenolinguist who had not had a reason to get off the couch in 4 months. I do not believe in destiny. I believe in coffee makers and bad Wi-Fi security and the particular kind of stubborn that comes from a certain kind of upbringing. I got off the subway. I walked into the bureau building. I signed in at the desk, got a visitor badge, and rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The interns looked very young. I put my laptop on the conference table and opened it and started from the beginning, and by the time I finished talking, every person in that room was very still and very quiet, and the man at the head of the table, who had the look of someone who had been doing a thankless job for a long time and had made his peace with it, was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a person who has just understood that the thing they thought was abstract has become concrete. "How long do we have?" he asked. I thought about the timeline buried in the transmission, the rate of the Vreth advance, the distance. "Long enough," I said. "If we move now." He nodded once. He picked up the phone on the table. And Earth moved. The committee assembled in 72 hours, which is extremely fast by government standards, and nearly incomprehensibly slow by the standards of the situation we were in. But it is what it is, and we made it work. I want to be clear about what the committee was not. It was not a war cabinet of generals and admirals making sweeping decisions over a holographic globe. It was not a room full of brilliant scientists in matching lab coats with color-coded screens. It was 5 people in a conference room in a building that also contained a motor vehicle authority, eating sandwiches out of plastic wrappers and trying to figure out how to respond to a genocidal alien empire with the resources currently available to a species that had never fought anyone who wasn't itself. 5 people. Dr. Owen Lark, weapons physicist, University of Edinburgh, who had not slept a full night since the previous decade and showed it in the specific way that certain very brilliant people show long-term sleep deprivation, which is to say, he looked fine, but something behind his eyes was running on a different fuel source than the rest of his face. Commander Dale Prentice and Commander Nina Frost, former Special Operations, both retired, both called back in with the kind of phone call that does not actually require a yes, because everyone involved understands the yes is already given. They communicated with each other primarily in glances and silences that had the density of full sentences. When they did speak, it was short and precise and finished. Dr. Cora Field, marine biology, specializing in apex predator behavior and ecological psychology, who brought a thermos of green tea to every meeting and had the unsettling habit of looking at you the way a person looks at a very interesting specimen. And me, the xenolinguist, the one who had gotten the call. Then there was Sewell. Sewell was the conclave's assigned liaison to Earth's response team. 7 limbs, roughly the shape of something that had decided bilaterally symmetry was an interesting suggestion rather than a requirement. Their species communicated primarily through bioluminescent color pulses across their skin, and I had spent 36 hours building a translation framework that could handle it in something close to real time, which meant I wore a small camera rig on my collar and watched a readout on my phone, and sometimes made Sewell wait while I worked through a particularly layered phrase. Sewell arrived on a Tuesday. They stood in the doorway of the conference room and looked at the 5 of us, and went a very particular shade of amber. I checked my notes. Amber, in Sewell's color language, mapped approximately to cautious reassessment of prior assumptions. What did they expect? Nina asked me quietly. More people, I said. Probably more everything. Sewell moved to the seat we had prepared for them, which required some improvisation given the limb situation, and settled, and looked at each of us in turn. Then they went a color that I had only seen once in my translation research, a deep blue-green with a gold undertone that an archival source described as used historically to signify something that has no prior category. I showed the readout to Dale. He looked at it. He nodded once, as though that confirmed something he had already suspected. The briefing began. The briefing was where it started to become clear, to Sewell, what Earth actually was. Not what Earth said it was. Not what our media or our self-image or our diplomatic language said we were, what the deployment data said we were, laid out in flat factual terms by 5 people eating sandwiches in a room that smelled like whiteboard marker and old carpet. Owen presented first. He was talking about the mycological denial system, which I am going to describe only as a method of making certain critical enemy infrastructure cease to function over a period of 11 to 14 days, in a manner that is difficult to predict or reverse. He described it the way people describe weather, matter of fact, slightly bored, as though the interesting part was the underlying biochemistry, not the application, and the application was just what you did with the interesting biochemistry. Sewell went amber again, then a pale gray I did not have a good translation for. I filed it under processing. Cora presented next, the Apex Predator Ecology segment. I will not detail the full contents of what she presented, because some of it is still not declassified, and some of it I personally find difficult to think about too directly even now, but I will say that it included behavioral adaptation data, and environmental tolerance ranges, and a logistics framework for deploying Earth's largest land-based predators in zero-atmosphere insertion scenarios. And when she finished, she sipped her green tea and looked at Sewell the way she looked at everyone, which was with the focused and genuinely curious attention of someone who finds all living things fascinating. Sewell was a color I had no record of anywhere in my database. I leaned over. "I don't have that one," I told them quietly. Sewell pulsed, and after a moment, the color shifted to something I could read. The nearest translation, from an archaic conclave dialect used only in ceremonial contexts, was ritually impossible and yet occurring. I wrote it in my notes. I did not tell the others immediately because I did not want to interrupt Owen, who had moved on to the second phase of the weapons framework and was drawing something on the whiteboard that looked like a network diagram and was actually a deployment sequence for something he called a cascade denial architecture, and was doing so with the quiet enthusiasm of a man describing a favorite recipe. After the briefing, Sewell asked to speak with me privately. We stood in the hallway by the elevator. Sewell pulsed slowly, which I had learned meant they were choosing their words with particular care. The color they showed me translated, across 3 archival sources I had to triangulate, to something like, "You knew what you were, and you came anyway." "Yes," I said. They pulsed again. The question was clear even before I ran the full translation. Why? I thought about what to say. I thought about the math that 42 civilizations had done. I thought about the rational calculation, the clean survival logic, the very reasonable and defensible decision to look at a losing fight and walk away from it. I thought about 4 minutes of names. "Because the file was empty," I said, "and we don't love leaving things empty." Sewell considered this for a long time. The color that came was slow and layered, and took me several minutes to work through fully. When I had it, I stood in the hallway with my phone in my hand and read it twice. It said, "We sent the signal to 43 civilizations because the mathematics required 43 attempts. We did not expect the 43rd to answer differently. We did not build our hope for it." I put my phone in my pocket. "We have a bad habit," I told them, "of doing things the math says we shouldn't." The deployment continued around us while I said this. In the building and outside it and across the planet, things were being organized and loaded and prepared, a vast and complicated and somewhat terrifying mobilization that was happening with a speed that surprised even the people running it, because it turns out that a species which has been fighting itself for its entire history has a great deal of infrastructure already built for exactly this kind of situation, and what it mostly needed was a direction. Now it had one. Sewell's color shifted one more time. I looked it up later, that night, in my apartment with the curtains finally open for the first time in months. It was an old word, pre-conclave, from one of the founding species, used in their early religious texts to describe the moment when a thing you had given up on turned out to still be possible. There was no single English equivalent. The closest I found was relief that arrives too late to feel entirely safe. I understood that perfectly. In the conclave's hall of petitions, which Sewell showed me on a small projected display before we went back into the meeting, every civilization's response was filed and visible. 42 entries, each one time-stamped, each one with the formal language of refusal. And Earth's entry, still empty. Not because we had failed to respond, because we had skipped the paperwork and gone straight to packing. I asked Sewell if that was irregular by conclave standards. The color that came was brief and unmistakable. It meant yes. Then another color, shorter still. It meant good. The Vreth had a name for the moment of first contact with a new civilization. It translated roughly as the opening of the ledger, which tells you something important about how they thought about conquest. It was not, for them, a military event primarily. It was a bureaucratic one, a new entry in a record that had been accumulating for longer than most civilizations they encountered had existed. They opened Earth's ledger with the confidence of an organization that has performed the same procedure 63 times and found it to be reliable. What they found instead was something that did not fit their ledger at all. I was aboard the advanced ship when the Vreth hailed us. The ship was small, which was intentional. Sending a massive fleet first would have read, in Vreth tactical language, as an act of war before negotiations. Sending something small read as ignorance of their protocol, which was actually a more accurate description of our approach than it might seem, because while we understood their protocol, we had made a collective decision at the committee level to decline to follow it. The advanced ship had 4 crew members and me, and the pressurized container in the cargo hold, which the ship's AI had flagged with a notation that said sound profile, unclassifiable, and which nobody on the crew discussed directly, though everyone was aware of it. The hail came in on a standard frequency. I had spent the flight preparing a translation matrix for Vreth communicative structure, which is layered in a way that makes their language feel like a series of locked rooms, each one opened by the room before it. Understanding what they said required understanding what they meant by saying it in the particular order they chose, and the order was itself a form of dominance assertion. I had made notes. The Vreth commander's name, transliterated, was Veth Oru Khan. In their language, names were titles that described function. His name meant, as precisely as I could render it, the one who finalizes. He opened with their standard contact sequence. Energy discharge across our bow, close enough that the ship's instruments registered it as a heat event. Then the fleet-scale display, a coordinated maneuver by 40 ships that arranged them in a pattern that, in Vreth visual language, represented absolute enclosure. Then the formal address. I translated as he spoke, whispering into my recorder. He said, "You are within the territory of the Vreth Authority. Your civilization has been assessed. You will now choose." He did not say what we would choose between. In 63 prior contacts, he had never needed to. There was a pause. Then one of our crew members, a man named Callum Owen, who had been brought along under the paperwork designation Operational Asset, Psychological Profile Omega, leaned toward the comm and pressed the open channel button. Callum was 31 years old. He had done things in places I did not know the names of, for organizations I did not have clearance to be told about. He had a very calm face and the particular stillness of a person who has learned to experience high-intensity situations as something close to ordinary. He did not acknowledge the fleet display. He said, "How many of your crew have names?" I heard the question. I had helped write it. I had written it in 6 different formulations before Callum and the commanders, and I settled on this version, in this exact phrasing, because the phrasing was the point. It was not a tactical question. On the Vreth end, there was silence. Their translator was running. I could hear, faintly, the processing delay that indicated a complex rerouting, the linguistic equivalent of a person checking their notes, because the question did not match the script they had prepared for. They came back with a clarification request. Was this a command hierarchy inquiry? Callum said, "No." Another pause. A second clarification. Was this a population assessment? Callum said, "No." The longest pause yet. I watched the ship's comm display. The Vreth channel stayed open, which meant they had not dismissed the question. They were doing something with it, running it through frameworks that were not producing a satisfying output. I knew what was happening on their end, because I had spent 3 weeks in the Conclave archives reading Vreth contact documentation from the civilizations they had conquered, the ones that had submitted rather than faced erasure, and had consequently survived in a diminished form and kept records of their early interactions. The Vreth had a doctrine for everything, a contact protocol, a response tree, a set of expected conversational moves that allowed them to categorize the civilization in front of them and proceed accordingly. There was no branch of the response tree for your crew. Do they have names? The Vreth commander came back on the channel. He asked what the purpose of the question was. Callum said, "There are 14,000 hours of names of people your empire has killed, recorded by the people who loved them, because in their culture, a person without a name becomes nothing. We wanted to know if you thought about that, about names, about whether yours count." The silence this time was different. I felt it before I could analyze it. A quality of pause that was not tactical processing, not protocol rerouting. Something else. The silence of a thing encountering a wall it had not known was there, and discovering, for the first time, that it cannot simply walk through. I thought about the conclave's hall of petitions, the 42 careful refusals, the mathematics of it, everyone doing the math, everyone arriving at the correct rational answer. The Vreth had built an empire on the assumption that the math was universal, that every civilization, when faced with overwhelming force, would calculate correctly and act accordingly. They had never met a civilization that had heard 4 minutes of names and decided the math was beside the point. Veth Oru Khan requested a 6-hour recess to consult his hierarchy. He was back in 40 minutes. The tone had changed. Not the words. The words were still formal, still structured in the layered Vreth manner, still carrying the architectural dominance of their language, but underneath the structure, in the ordering of the phrases, in the small hesitations before certain formulations, something had shifted. I translated for the crew. I translated as precisely as I could, and then I said, "He is recalibrating. He came into this contact with a complete model of what we were going to do, and we did not do it, and now he is building a new model, and he does not have enough information yet." Dale nodded once. Nina said, "Good." Callum sat back in his seat and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at the comm display and said nothing, which was its own kind of language. And me? I was watching the cargo hold indicator on the panel beside me, where the pressurized container's environmental readout was displayed in small green numbers. The numbers were steady, normal. Whatever was in there was settled and calm. I thought, that will not last. I thought, very little about this situation is going to last. I thought about the 42 civilizations that had received the signal and done the rational thing, and how this moment, this specific pause in a specific conversation in the dark between stars, was the direct result of one civilization that had been asleep when the signal arrived, and so had never gotten around to making the rational choice. We had not calculated our way here. We had stumbled here, through a coffee maker, through 4 minutes of names, through a committee of 5 people eating sandwiches and a marine biologist with a thermos of green tea and a weapons physicist who hadn't slept properly since the previous decade. Veth Oru Khan was on the line again. He said, in the formal structure of the Vreth language but with a hesitation before the verb that his culture would have read as deeply undignified, "We would hear more of what you have to say." I translated this for the crew. Callum looked at Dale. Dale looked at Nina. Nina looked at me. I looked at my notes. "He's not asking for terms," I said. "He's asking for context. He wants to understand what kind of thing we are." "Tell him," Nina said, "that we are happy to explain." I keyed the comm. I started talking. I told Veth Oru Khan about the conclave's distress signal. I told him about the 14,000 hours of names. I told him that Earth had received the signal at 3 in the morning, and that by 9 we had called the Department of Defense, because there was apparently something in us that could not hear a list of names that long, and do nothing. I told him we had not consulted anyone. We had not called a conference. We had not weighed options or formed committees beyond the 5 people currently eating sandwiches. He asked, "Who authorized this response?" I thought about the empty file in the Hall of Petitions. I said, "We did. All of us. The way you authorize things when you're the kind of species that doesn't wait to be told." Another long silence. Then Veth Oru Khan said something I had to translate 3 times before I was sure I had it right, because it was not a thing I had ever seen in Vreth communication records, not in 63 conquests worth of documentation. He asked, "Are you not afraid?" The cargo hold indicator was still showing steady green numbers. I thought about my apartment, 4 months of curtains closed, the coffee maker on the counter, the particular quality of silence that fills a space when a person has been in it too long alone. I thought about stepping out into the hallway with my hand on the doorframe. I said, "We're always afraid. We just don't find it very convincing as a reason to stop." The Vreth channel was quiet for a long time after that. When he came back, Veth Oru Khan asked to speak with whoever was in command of our expedition. I looked at Callum. He leaned forward toward the comm. He said, "You're talking to them." The war lasted 3 weeks. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the thing that is remarkable about those 3 weeks is not the scale of it, though the scale was considerable, and not the outcome, though the outcome was the thing that changed everything. What is remarkable, and what I find difficult to explain to people who weren't there watching it happen, is the quality of it. The texture, the way it moved. The Vreth fought the way an institution fights. This is not an insult. They had built their empire on 63 successful campaigns, and their military was genuinely formidable, with a command structure that had been refined across centuries and a fleet capacity that exceeded anything in the Conclave's combined history. They were not underestimating anyone. They had looked at Earth's advance team. They had heard the conversation with Veth Oru Khan. They had requested time to recalibrate, and then they had deployed with the full seriousness of an empire that had decided it was time to end something before it could become a problem. They fought in formations. They fought in sequences. They fought with the deep institutional confidence of an organization that has a procedure for every situation and has never encountered a situation the procedures could not handle. Earth fought the way water finds its way through rock. Not with force against force, with presence, with patience, with the unsettling capacity to be somewhere unexpected and then be gone and then be somewhere else unexpected, so that the Vreth's response was always slightly behind where it needed to be, like a person trying to catch their own shadow. Cora explained it to me on the 5th day, sitting in the observation room of the command station with her thermos of green tea and a tablet full of data. Apex predators, she said, don't win by being stronger than their prey. They win by understanding their prey's patterns better than the prey understands them. The prey moves predictably because it has a plan. The predator moves unpredictably because it has an objective. The Vreth had a plan, a very good plan, an elaborately detailed plan developed over centuries. Our 12 operationally unmanageable people had objectives. Objectives are harder to counter than plans. I watched the tactical feeds from the command station with Sewell, who had been brought aboard after the initial contact. Sewell watched everything with the sustained and serious attention of someone who is trying to revise a fundamental understanding of reality in real time and is taking the project seriously. On day 7, 3 Vreth fleet formations came apart in sequence across a 6-hour window. They did not come apart because they were destroyed. They came apart because their command infrastructure stopped functioning. Supply chains went dark. Communication relays dropped off. Logistics systems that had been running for a decade simply ceased. Owen's mycological work. He watched the results come in on the 3rd day with the expression of a person watching a proof resolve cleanly, which for him was probably the most satisfying thing imaginable. Sewell watched the same feeds and went a color that took me a while to look up. When I found it in the archive, I read the translation several times. It said, "This is how your species has always survived." Not a question, a conclusion arrived at from data. I looked at the feeds. I thought about the long human history of finding our way through things that should have ended us, plague and ice, and the various catastrophic ways we had damaged our own planet and each other over centuries, surviving through adaptation and stubbornness, and the specific human talent for doing something completely unreasonable in a crisis, because the reasonable options had run out. "Yes," I said. Sewell pulsed slowly. "We did not know this about you." "Most of us don't know it about ourselves," I said. "You mostly figure it out while it's happening." On day 12, a Vreth supply convoy disappeared for 11 days. Not destroyed, not captured, just gone, from their sensors and their communication network both. When elements of it reappeared on day 23, Sewell and I were in the observation room together, and we watched the Vreth Command's response to the reappearance on the intercept feeds. And what I saw in their communication patterns was something I had not expected to see from an empire that had not shown fear in 63 campaigns. They were being careful, not aggressive, not retaliatory, careful, moving slowly where before they had moved with certainty. That was the shift. That was the moment the 3 weeks resolved from a conflict into something else. Dale came into the observation room on day 18 and sat down next to me without preamble, which was his way. "They've sent a request," he said. "I know," I said. I had seen it in the comm logs. "It's a ceasefire inquiry," he said. I nodded. He looked at me for a moment. "In 63 campaigns, they've never sent one." "I know," I said again. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the tactical feeds. "What do you think it means?" I thought about Veth Oru Khan's question, delivered through a comm channel in the dark between stars. "Are you not afraid?" I thought about the specific quality of that question, what it revealed about the shape of his understanding of conflict, that he could conceive of fear but not of proceeding in the presence of it. "I think it means," I said slowly, "that they've figured out what kind of thing we are." Dale looked at the feeds. "Good," he said. "We prepared for ceasefire negotiations, the way you prepare for anything important, which is to say, we were not as prepared as we wanted to be, and more prepared than we feared we might be, and we moved forward anyway." I was assigned lead translator. The negotiation table, such as it was, existed in a digital communication space, a structured exchange channel that the conclave had provided and that both parties had agreed to use, which was itself significant because agreement on anything was not how this conflict had been operating. On one side, Callum, Dale, Nina, and me. On the other side, Veth Oru Khan and his senior officers, their visual feeds showing the particular stillness of beings who have been in a state of high intensity for 3 weeks and are now performing calm as a matter of institutional necessity. The formalities took an hour, both sides stating names, positions, authorization levels. The Vreth did this by rote, moving through it with the efficiency of long practice. I noticed, partway through, that they listed names, full names. Names that in their own language were titles of function, yes, but which were individual, specific, belonging to particular beings and no one else. I noted this. When it was my turn to confirm my role, I gave my name, Mara Voss, xenolinguist. Earth delegation. Veth Oru Khan looked at me through the display with an expression I had no Vreth reference for, something that lived between recognition and something older, harder to name. He said, "You were on the advance ship." I said yes. He said, "You ask about names." I said yes. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What is it that your delegation requires?" I set down my notes. I had prepared this carefully. I had prepared it in full Vreth formal structure, with the correct layering and the appropriate sequencing, and all the protocol elements his culture required for a demand to be received as legitimate. I said, "Restoration for the conclave, material reparation for conquered civilizations, and recognition of the named dead." He asked, "What does recognition require?" I said, "Every name, all 14,000 hours, entered into your empire's official record, spoken, in original language, as a formal act of recognition, because in the conclave's understanding, a person without a name is a person unmade, and your empire unmade a great many people." The silence was very long. His senior officers were very still. I waited. When Veth Oru Khan spoke again, the layering of his language had shifted. The formal dominant structure was still there, because I did not think he was capable of dropping it, but beneath it there was something else, something I had only seen in one other context, the archival recordings from the first species the Vreth had ever conquered, before their empire was an empire, in the very earliest documentation of what they were. In those recordings, the Vreth had a word they no longer used, a word that referred to the weight of what you had done, the accumulated specific reality of every individual action in a long history of actions. They had stopped using it sometime in the 2nd century of their empire. I thought maybe they were about to need it again. He asked, "How long will it take?" I said, "However long it takes." He asked, "And if we agree to this?" I said, "Then the file stops being empty." He did not understand the reference. His translator offered him 3 possible interpretations, and I could see him considering them, and I watched him arrive, slowly, at the closest one. He said, "And if the file is no longer empty?" I said, "Then we have a calendar instead of a conflict." and we know the difference. He sat with that. Eventually he said, "We will need to consult our hierarchy." I said, "Of course." He said, "We will respond within the standard period." I said, "We'll be here." The channel closed. Dale looked at me. "The standard period is 6 hours," I said. "In 63 campaigns, he's never consulted anyone. He makes the decisions." Nina said, "So he needs to tell his empire they're doing this." I said, "I think so." Callum had not said anything during the entire negotiation. He looked at the closed channel for a moment, and then at his hands, and then at me. "Do you think they'll do it?" he said. I thought about 14,000 hours of names. I thought about the empty file. I thought about Sewell's color, the archaic one, the one that meant relief that arrives too late to feel entirely safe. "Yes," I said. They responded in 4 hours. The terms were accepted. Not all of them. Not immediately. Not without further negotiation over the following weeks on the specific form and timeline of each requirement. But the framework was accepted, and in the Vreth's institutional logic, a framework acceptance was binding, and so the 3-week war became a negotiation that was also a reckoning, and the conclave sat in on every session, and Sewell translated for their side while I translated for ours, and we sat across from each other at the digital table for weeks and worked our way through every detail. I went home when it was over. That sounds simple. It was not simple. Going home is never simple when you have been the person in the room where a thing like that happens, and you come back to a studio apartment with curtains that had been closed for 4 months, and a coffee maker that had changed the course of several civilizations by intercepting a Wi-Fi signal at 3 in the morning. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I made coffee. I opened the curtains. The street outside was ordinary, in the way that streets become extraordinary. When you have been somewhere they are not, when you have sat across from an empire that had ended 63 civilizations and watched it learn to ask instead of declare. The ordinary quality of the street, the specific morning light, the sound of the city doing its ordinary city things, hit me somewhere in the chest and stayed there. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and opened my laptop. The frequency was there. The conclave's broadcast, running every day on the open channel Earth had agreed to maintain as a condition of the settlement. 4 hours a day, transmitted across every public band we had, the names cycling through, alien phonemes and impossible consonants and sounds that no human mouth had ever been shaped to make. I had not opened it since I got back. I sat there for a while with the laptop open and the frequency visible and the coffee getting cold, which is a habit I apparently cannot break no matter the circumstances. 6 months had passed since the committee room, since the sandwiches in the plastic wrappers and Owen's whiteboard diagram and Cora's green tea thermos and Dale and Nina's language of silences. 6 months since a coffee maker at 3 in the morning. Cora had sent me a paper on apex predator psychology. No subject line, no message, just the paper, attached, dropped into my inbox like a note left under a door. I had read it at 2 in the morning and understood that it was her way of saying something she did not have language for any other way, which is that some animals are defined not by what they destroy, but by what they choose not to, and the choosing is what matters, and the choosing has to be made again every time. Owen had sent me a single line. The biochemistry paper is getting published. I did not ask which one. Dale had sent nothing, which was Dale's version of a letter. Nina had sent a photograph. No caption. It was a picture of a very ordinary road in what looked like the countryside somewhere, in the late afternoon, with long shadows and the particular golden color that light gets in the last hour before dark. I had looked at it for a long time. I still did not entirely know what she meant by it. Sewell had sent a color. I had to research it for an hour. It was archaic, pre-conclave, from one of the founding species, used in their early religious texts in a specific context that I will try to explain as accurately as I can. It was used to describe the moment after a great storm, when a person who has been sheltering in a small place steps outside and finds that the world is still there, that it did not end while they were waiting, that the step outside, which felt like risk, turned out to be the thing that proved the world was real. In the founding species tradition, this moment had a name. The color was the name. I sat with that for a long time. The UN Bureau of Extraterrestrial Affairs had offered me a directorship. My name on the door. 400 people now instead of 11. A department that no longer shared its building with a motor vehicle authority, because it had been given its own building, a real one, with actual resources, and a mandate that had the weight of a planet's unanimous decision behind it. I had told them I'd think about it. I had been thinking about it for 6 months. At 3:17 in the morning, 6 months to the day since my coffee maker made a sound. I was awake. I had not been sleeping well, which was not new. I sat up. I listened. It was not a signal. It was the heating element. A loose connection making a clicking sound that I had been meaning to have looked at and had not gotten around to, because old habits are persistent even when your life has rearranged itself completely around a new shape. I sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark. Then I opened my laptop. I found the frequency. I pressed play. The names came into the apartment like water comes into a space, filling the silence, moving into all the corners. I could not pronounce them. I could not fully understand them. I could not do anything useful with them in the way I am trained to do useful things with language. I sat and listened. I listened because it was the only thing I could give that cost me something real. Not my expertise, not my clearance or my translation skills or any of the professional capacities that had made me useful to governments and committees. Just my time and my attention and the specific human act of being present for a thing that asks to be witnessed. The conclave believed that a person without a name becomes nothing, that the witness is what makes the wait real. I sat in my kitchen in the dark and was a witness. When the morning came, I called the bureau. The woman who answered sounded young and very organized and slightly overwhelmed in the specific way of someone who has recently discovered that their job is significantly larger than the job description indicated. I told her I'd take the directorship. She said wonderful and began talking about orientation schedules and office assignments, and I let her talk for a moment and then I said, "I have one condition." She said, "Of course, anything." I said, "Keep the frequency open, every public band we have, every day. Do not let it become optional or deniable or something that gets quietly discontinued because the crisis is over and the political will has moved on to other things." She said, "Can I ask why?" I thought about Veth Oru Khan, 63 campaigns, a ledger that had never had an empty entry until it met us. I thought about his question in the dark between stars. "Are you not afraid?" I thought about the 42 refusals filed neatly in the Hall of Petitions, every one of them rational, every one of them correct by the math. I thought about a coffee maker at 3:17 in the morning. I said, because the Vreth needed to understand how many names there were, how long the list was, how specific and individual and irreplaceable every single one of them was. They needed to sit with that, every day, not as an abstract historical fact, but as a lived ongoing reality, 4 hours a day, until it stopped being information and started being understanding. She was quiet for a moment. I said, "And so do we, every single morning. That is the condition. That is the only one." She said, "I'll make sure it's in the agreement." I said, "Thank you." I hung up. Outside, the morning was doing what mornings do, ordinary and specific, and already busy with itself. The city running through its routines, 7 billion people going about the particular urgent business of their lives, most of them unaware that 3 weeks in deep space had changed something fundamental about how the universe understood us. I got my coat. I found my bag. I checked that my laptop was charged. The frequency was still running through the small speaker on my counter. Names, in voices that had traveled further than I could make my brain honestly comprehend, filling the kitchen with a sound that was not music and not speech in any sense I had been trained to categorize, but which was something, which was specific, which was the opposite of silence in the most important way. I turned toward the door. I put my hand on the frame, the way I had 6 months ago, the morning after the coffee maker first spoke. Then I let go. I stepped out. The door closed behind me. The names kept going.